She didn't recognize him at first. Just another customer at a quiet corner booth. A slow Tuesday morning at a nearly empty diner. And there he was, sitting alone with his coffee, reading a newspaper like it was 1952. No cameras, no entourage. Just a quiet, older man who smiled when she asked if he wanted cream. But when he left, he didn't just leave a tip. He left a note, folded neatly under the edge of the plate. And when she unfolded it and saw the name written at the bottom, Clint Eastwood, her knees nearly gave out. The note was short, simple, but what it said would change not just her day, but her entire life. This is the true story of a woman who thought no one saw her, until one man did. They call it the graveyard shift for a reason, not because it's eerie or haunted, but because it's quiet, still, a little forgotten by the rest of the world. It's the kind of silence that doesn't beg for attention. It just is. And for Keisha Miller, that silence had become routine, familiar. At 33 years old, Keisha had mastered the art of early mornings. She'd been working the 6 a.m. shift at Rosie's Diner for the better part of 7 years. A small old-school spot tucked between a dry cleaner and a gas station on the edge of Atlanta. Rosie's wasn't exactly a tourist destination, but it had regulars. Retired men with stories to tell, night shift nurses grabbing breakfast before bed, and the occasional traveler who wandered in from the nearby interstate. Keisha knew most of them by name, and most of them knew her as the woman who always smiled, even when she was clearly exhausted. That morning had started like all the others, cold, rainy, the kind of weather that made people stay in bed a little longer. Keisha arrived 15 minutes early like she always did, unlocking the back door, tying on her faded apron, and flipping on the coffee machine before the sun had even begun to show. The warmth of the diner felt good after the chill outside. She wiped down the counter, set out the sugar caddies, and restocked the napkins with muscle memory. There wasn't much to think about. Her hands did the work while her mind floated elsewhere. Jalen's field trip was coming up. She had to remember to sign that permission slip. Her mother's prescriptions needed picking up before Friday, and the rent was due next week, with tips looking lighter than usual this month. She tried not to stress, but the mental checklist never really shut off. Lisa, her co-worker, was late again. No surprise there. Keisha didn't mind, though. She preferred the calm before the storm, and the diner was usually empty until closer to 7 anyway. She poured herself a cup of coffee, black and strong, and stared out the fogged-up front windows as the rain tapped gently against the glass. By 6:40 a.m., the world outside was still gray, the city just beginning to yawn awake. That's when the bell above the door jingled, soft, unmistakable. She glanced up out of habit, expecting to see old Marvin from the corner apartment, or maybe the young EMT who always ordered pancakes with extra syrup, but it wasn't anyone she recognized. A tall, older man walked in slowly, dressed in a plain brown jacket and a worn baseball cap. He paused just inside the doorway, his eyes scanning the diner like he was taking it in for the first time. There was a calmness about him, but also something hard to place, like a quiet intensity. He walked with a slight limp, noticeable but not dramatic, and moved with the kind of caution that comes from experience. Keisha gave him her usual warm smile. "Morning. Sit wherever you like." He nodded silently and chose a booth in the far corner, facing the window. Not in a hurry, not looking for conversation. Just there. She grabbed a menu and made her way over, coffee pot in hand. "Coffee to start?" He looked up and gave a polite smile. "Yes, please." "Black." His voice was deep, gravelly, not unkind, just aged like good leather. She set the cup down, poured the coffee, and slid the menu across the table. "Take your time," she said. "No rush." He nodded again. "Appreciate it." She walked away, not thinking much of it. Just another early customer passing through. But something about him stayed in the back of her mind. He didn't touch the menu right away, just stared out the window, sipping his coffee slowly. The way he looked outside wasn't like someone lost in thought. It was more like someone remembering. Like the world beyond the glass was different for him than it was for everyone else. Keisha busied herself behind the counter, refilling the creamers, folding napkins, and keeping an eye on the clock. She glanced over at the man occasionally. He hadn't ordered anything yet. She gave it another few minutes before heading back over. "You all set, sir?" He turned to look at her again, and this time, his eyes lingered a little longer. "Yeah," he said, setting the menu down. "Just some eggs, scrambled, and wheat toast if you have it." "You got it," Keisha said, scribbling on her notepad. "Bacon or sausage?" "No meat," he said. "Just the eggs and toast." She gave him a small nod and walked toward the kitchen window, calling the order out to the cook. Just as she passed the corner of the counter, she heard his voice again, low, almost hesitant. "You've got a kindness about you," he said. Keisha turned, surprised. "Say again?" He looked down at his coffee, swirling it in the cup. "You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago." She smiled the same way you do. "Even when things weren't easy." Keisha gave a soft laugh, not sure how to respond. Compliments from older customers weren't rare, but this one felt different, honest, heavy. "Well," she said with a shrug, "I figure kindness is free, and coffee tastes better with a smile." He nodded slightly, as if filing that away. More people should think like that. She went back to work, pretending not to overthink the exchange. But for some reason, her heart felt a little heavier after that. Like something had shifted. Not in a bad way, but in a way she couldn't explain. The order came up 10 minutes later. She brought it over, refilled his coffee, and wished him a good meal. He thanked her again, quiet as always, and dug in slowly, like a man in no rush to finish. The diner was starting to wake up. A few regulars trickled in, nodding their hellos. The jukebox clicked on with a low, crackling tune from the 70s. Keisha moved between tables, pouring refills, jotting down orders, cleaning up spills. She was in her flow now, graceful and efficient, like a dancer who knew every step by heart. But every so often her eyes drifted back to the man in the corner. He stayed longer than most solo diners. Almost an hour passed before he pushed his plate away and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out some cash, folded neatly, and tucked it under the coffee cup. Then he stood up slowly, adjusted his jacket, and walked out without a word. Keisha was clearing a nearby table when she noticed he'd left. She walked over to his booth to grab the dishes, and that's when she saw it. Underneath the plate was a small folded piece of paper. At first, she thought it might be a receipt, or maybe a napkin with some scribbled feedback. But it was something else entirely. She picked it up slowly. The handwriting was clean, slanted, masculine. She unfolded it with one hand, balancing a tray in the other. And what she read made her heart skip a beat. The note was short, just a few lines. But it wasn't the words that stunned her. It was the signature. At the very bottom, in the same steady handwriting, were two unmistakable words. Clint Eastwood. Keisha stared at the note, blinking in disbelief. Clint Eastwood? Her knees weakened. She sat down in the booth before she could fall over, because the note didn't just carry his name. It carried a message that would change everything. A quiet man in the corner. He walked in without a sound, unnoticed at first, like a shadow slipping through the seams of a quiet morning. The air inside Rosie's diner was warm and still, the kind of stillness only found in early hours, and his presence disturbed nothing. No grand entrance, no air of importance, just a man, tall and weathered, stepping into the corner of a sleepy Atlanta morning. His clothing was simple. A worn brown jacket that carried the shape of his shoulders like it had done so for decades. Blue jeans faded and creased, boots with scuffed toes that suggested more use than care. A baseball cap rested low on his brow, aged but well kept, the brim casting a faint shadow across his eyes. There was no phone in his hand, no hurried movement, no sign that he had anywhere urgent to be. Just the steady walk of a man who'd lived a full life, now walking a little slower, carrying more memories than ambition. He moved to the far corner of the diner and sat in the booth closest to the window, choosing the seat that gave him the clearest view of everything. Not in a suspicious way, not even cautious, just intentional. Like he had always been someone who preferred the edges of a room. The people who do that are rarely looking to be seen. They're watching, measuring, remembering. There was something in the way he settled in that made him feel familiar, even if his face wasn't. He exuded a quietness, not the empty kind, but the deep kind, the kind born from places where words are used sparingly, only when they count. There was an old soul gravity to him, as though he had carried too many truths for too long and had learned to live without the need to share them. He placed his hands around the coffee cup that was brought to him, holding it like something sacred. His fingers were thick with time, marked by veins and scars and subtle tremors. The cup stayed near his mouth, but not for long stretches. He drank in measured sips, slow and appreciative, like every swallow was part of a ritual he'd performed 1,000 times before. He didn't touch the menu for several minutes, preferring instead to look out the fogged-up window, watching the rain trace thin lines down the glass. There was something behind his eyes, depth, not darkness. A weight that didn't beg for attention but couldn't be ignored if you really looked. He didn't fidget. He didn't check his phone. He didn't speak to anyone. And yet, his presence filled the room more than the usual noise ever did. Keisha noticed him in that quiet way. She noticed everything. She'd been in the diner long enough to tell when someone was just passing through, and when someone brought their history with them. This man was the latter. He hadn't just come in for coffee. He'd come in with something he hadn't yet named, something that seemed to sit silently on the table in front of him. There was nothing unusual about his order. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and black coffee. Plain, humble, routine. But what was unusual was how he watched the world around him, not with suspicion, but with something closer to reverence. He took in the diner like a painter studies a landscape. He noticed the way the waitress moved, the rhythm of the doorbell chime, the faded jukebox crackling in the corner. He watched Keisha with a calm attentiveness, not invasive or rude, just present. Like he saw something in her he couldn't quite name. She moved between tables like she always did, graceful and practiced, her smile consistent no matter who she served. He watched her, not like someone seeing a stranger, but like someone remembering. It became clear that the man wasn't just observing the room, he was observing her. There was no malice in it, no curiosity to be questioned. It was something else, something quiet. He saw her in a way people rarely do. Not just her uniform or her voice, but the way she carried exhaustion without letting it define her, the way she offered warmth to everyone without expecting it in return. He saw her as a whole person, not just a waitress. As the minutes passed, his expression remained the same. Soft lines at the corners of his mouth, the kind that come from frowning more than laughing. His eyes scanned the diner slowly, resting on familiar details that seemed unfamiliar to him, like he was looking for something he used to know. Or maybe someone. The longer he stayed, the more he seemed at ease. Not comfortable exactly, but settled. Like he'd found something in the stillness of the place that answered a question he hadn't been able to ask elsewhere. He ate slowly, deliberately. No distractions. No rush. The eggs, the toast, and a second cup of coffee were taken in with the reverence of a man who'd eaten many meals alone. A man who understood the value of silence and good food served without judgment. When he finally finished, he didn't leave immediately. He sat for a few more minutes, looking once more out the window as if to confirm something invisible. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out some cash, folded neatly, tucked together like someone who had always done things with care. And then he pulled out something else, a piece of paper. It was white, clean, folded with precision. He didn't wave it or write on it in view. He simply placed it under the edge of the plate with quiet purpose, then stood, adjusted his jacket, and left as quietly as he had arrived. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't glance back. The only evidence he'd ever been there was an empty plate, a few bills under the cup, and that note. When Keisha returned to clear the booth, she found the paper. It was folded once, crisp and light, but it seemed to carry an unexpected weight. On the outside, written in careful handwriting, were 6 words that made her pause. For the woman with the kind eyes. She opened it slowly, unsure of what to expect. The note was brief, a few sentences, nothing grand. But the words sank into her like warm water after a cold day. They were simple but honest. Words that acknowledged something deeper in her, something she'd spent years hiding under routine, under exhaustion, under the armor of quiet resilience. The words didn't flatter, they recognized, and that made all the difference. Behind her smile, the years that followed weren't easy, but they were full of late nights and early mornings, doctor's appointments, food stamps, scraped knees, missed buses, surprise fevers, and school projects made from whatever they had in the junk drawer. Life came at her fast, and all at once. Her mother, Gloria, moved in shortly after Jalen turned 2. The arthritis was getting worse, and work had become more pain than paycheck. Gloria had always been proud, always independent, a housekeeper in Buckhead who moved like she had somewhere to be. But age doesn't ask permission when it comes for your body, so they made it work. The 3 of them. Keisha picked up shifts wherever she could, mornings at the diner, evenings at a call center when they needed extra hands. No weekends, no vacations, no me time. But the rent got paid, the lights stayed on. Jalen had shoes that fit and enough snacks to trade at lunch. Gloria had her medication. Keisha had the satisfaction of surviving. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. There was a rhythm to her exhaustion, a dull, permanent tired that clung to her shoulders like a second skin. But she wore it well. Not because she wasn't tired, but because there was no time to fall apart. So she smiled, not a fake smile, not a forced one either. The kind that said, "I'm here. I've got this. I'm still standing." Because the world didn't slow down for grieving women or struggling mothers, and she knew that. Life had taught her that early. She learned to stretch every dollar like it was elastic. New clothes for Jalen, thrift store finds for herself. Gloria's pain meds came before takeout or new shoes. Birthday parties were homemade cards, extra long hugs, and maybe a cupcake if there was a coupon involved. She never called it sacrifice. It was just life. And she never complained. Not because she didn't want to, but because it wouldn't change anything. Complaining didn't make the bus run on time or soften the landlord's voice when the rent was 3 days late. It didn't help the boss notice how hard she worked or stop Jalen's school from calling about forgotten permission slips. So instead she became reliable, solid, the one people could count on, the one who never called out, who covered shifts without asking for anything in return, who remembered how customers liked their coffee even when they didn't remember her name. Most of them didn't know she once dreamed of being a teacher. that she used to picture herself in a classroom, shaping young minds, decorating bulletin boards with construction paper and hope. That version of her had faded slowly, but not completely. There were still moments, quiet ones, early mornings before the house stirred, when she'd sit with a mug of lukewarm coffee and just breathe. Or nights when Jalen's laugh would echo down the hall and stir something soft inside her. Or when Gloria would hum gospel songs in the kitchen, and the warmth of it would remind her, this is still a life. A hard one, yes, but a life. Grief never really left. It just changed shape. Some days it showed up as a whisper, Marcus's favorite song on the radio. Other days it was a weight, an empty space at the dinner table during Jalen's birthday. But it was always there, tucked into the space between responsibility and routine. She missed being held, being asked how she was, not out of courtesy, but out of love. She missed softness, missed silence that didn't feel like loneliness. But even in that loneliness, she carried on, because her son was watching, because her mother was depending on her, because the world rarely made space for women like her to crumble. So she stayed whole. She became the kind of strong no one claps for, the kind you only notice when it's gone. Quiet, constant, unshakable. Until that Tuesday, a rainy morning, a nearly empty diner, a man in the corner booth with a newspaper and a black coffee. Nothing remarkable, really. She didn't even recognize him at first. No cameras, no entourage, just a polite smile and a calm presence. "Would you like some cream?" He shook his head. "Black is perfect." She walked away without a second thought. But when he left, he didn't just leave a tip. He left a note, folded neatly under the plate. Short, simple. She almost didn't see it. But when she picked it up and unfolded the paper and saw the name at the bottom, Clint Eastwood, her knees nearly gave out. Not because he was famous. Not really. But because the words on that note made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Seen. Truly seen. Not as a waitress, not as a single mom, not as a statistic or a smile behind the counter, but as a woman who mattered. And after years of giving, of holding everything together without expecting anyone to notice, someone finally did. And that changed everything. The strange compliment. Some customers come and go like passing thoughts. They order, they eat, they leave. A blur of faces, requests, and brief eye contact. But not him. He didn't blend in, not because he demanded attention, but because he carried stillness in a place built on motion. All morning, as the diner slowly filled with regulars and the background hum of clinking silverware and casual conversation returned to life, he remained in his booth. Calm, quiet, and observant. He wasn't staring. He wasn't invading anyone's space, but he watched, not with judgment or disinterest, but with the focused awareness of someone who had spent a long time listening to the world instead of talking over it. Keisha felt his gaze from time to time, just subtle enough to notice, never enough to disturb. Most people looked through waitresses. They ordered without eye contact, waved their empty cups impatiently, offered tight smiles or muttered thanks. Keisha had grown used to being invisible in plain sight, but this man wasn't looking at her like she was background noise. He watched her move between tables with a rhythm he seemed to respect. The way she remembered who wanted cream and who didn't. How she tucked a napkin into a child's collar without asking. The gentle hand she placed on a regular's shoulder while asking about his wife's surgery. It wasn't the service that caught his attention, it was the sincerity. And Keisha, for her part, didn't know how to feel about being seen. She had long learned to be careful around unfamiliar attention. Life had taught her that being noticed could sometimes mean being misunderstood. But his attention was different. Present, not possessive. Curious, not critical. Like he wasn't watching her, but what she represented. He finished his meal slowly, like a man in no hurry to get back to whatever waited for him outside. The plate was cleared, the coffee refilled, but he lingered. His eyes drifted between the window and the movement of the diner, as though he was measuring the moments passing around him. At one point, as Keisha passed by to check on another table, their eyes met again. It was brief, unspoken, but charged with something almost intangible. A quiet recognition. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, and for the first time that morning, she smiled back without hesitation. Later, as the crowd began to thin and the pace slowed, Keisha found herself behind the counter again, stacking clean mugs and wiping crumbs from the surface. The morning rush was winding down. The radio played something soft and nostalgic in the background. Outside, the rain had turned into a soft drizzle, the kind that made the streets glisten like silver threads. It was then that he stood up from his booth, took a few slow steps forward, and rested his hands lightly on the counter. Keisha looked up from her task, meeting his gaze again. There was something in his expression, something thoughtful, maybe even contemplative. He didn't open with a question or a compliment. Instead, he said something that caught her off guard. "You're the kind of person people forget," he said simply, "until they need saving." The words landed like a quiet bell ringing in an empty church. For a second, Keisha froze, not in fear, but in confusion. She let out a small, unsure laugh, the kind that escaped when you weren't sure if someone was joking or being profoundly sincere. "I'm sorry," she said, but there was no edge in her voice, just curiosity. He didn't explain further. He didn't follow it up with another sentence or soften it with a smile. He simply let the words settle between them, like he knew they didn't need clarification. Keisha stood there, still holding a mug in one hand, unsure how to respond. Compliments usually came in the form of "great service" or "you've got a beautiful smile." This wasn't that. This wasn't about her looks or her efficiency. It was about something deeper, something he saw that most people didn't take the time to find. She laughed again, quietly this time, more out of habit than humor. The man didn't laugh with her, but he didn't seem offended either. He nodded slightly, as if to acknowledge that she didn't know what to make of his words, and that was okay. And then, without another word, he walked back to his booth, settled into his seat, and returned to his slow sips of coffee and quiet observation. Keisha stood behind the counter a moment longer, still holding the mug, staring at nothing in particular. The compliment, or whatever it was, echoed in her mind louder than it had in the room. "You're the kind of person people forget until they need saving." What did that even mean? Did he sense something in her? Was it about the way she showed up for everyone else but herself? Did he see the tiredness behind the smile? Or was it just the poetic rambling of an older man who'd lived too long and carried too much? Whatever it meant, it stayed with her. Long after he left, long after the plate was cleared and the booth wiped down, long after the coffee cooled and the rain picked up again, it stayed with her because it felt true. And she wasn't used to hearing the truth said out loud in such a disarming way. In a world where people rarely looked beyond the surface, this man had seen her. Not just her service or her manners or her uniform, but her. The quiet strength, the invisible weight, the selflessness she wore like armor. She didn't know who he was yet, didn't know his name. But something told her this wasn't just another customer. And somehow, her life, so carefully constructed in routine and resilience, was about to change because of him. And maybe, deep down, she was ready for that. Who was that man? He didn't stay long after the plate was cleared. No lingering over coffee, no idle chatter or small talk to fill the silence. Just a quiet moment of stillness, a final sip, a glance through the window where the rain had softened into a sleepy drizzle. And then he stood. There was no announcement, no wave, no parting smile. He simply gathered himself, adjusted the brim of his cap, and slipped out the front door like a passing thought. There, and then gone. The bell above the entrance gave a soft jingle, but even that felt muted. Keisha barely noticed until she looked back toward the booth and saw the seat empty. No goodbye, no fuss. Just a clean plate, a mostly drained cup of coffee, and a folded stack of cash placed neatly beneath the edge of the mug. She walked over slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, already sliding into her familiar rhythm. Pick up the plate, wipe the table, reset for the next customer. Just another transaction in a long string of quiet exchanges. Just another face in the morning tide. But as she lifted the plate from the table, something caught her eye. There, carefully tucked beneath it, almost hidden, was a folded note. She paused, eyes narrowing, hand frozen mid-motion. It wasn't the usual napkin scribble, not a child's doodle or a receipt someone forgot to sign. It was deliberate, the kind of paper people used for real letters. White, smooth, folded once with precision. And on the front, written in clean, slanted handwriting, 6 simple words. For the woman with the kind eyes. The world seemed to quiet around her in that moment. She stood motionless for a beat, staring at the note like it might vanish if she blinked. Then, slowly, she unfolded it. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from something else, something unspoken. The message was short. You served me more than food today. You reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten, what quiet strength looks like. You give more than you take. You see more than you say. Don't let the world take that from you. Your light matters. Use this to make it shine. That was it. She stared at the words, feeling something deep inside her twist, not in pain, but recognition. It was like being handed a mirror when you hadn't looked at your reflection in years. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. There was no flourish, no performance, just honesty. But it wasn't the message alone that left her breathless. Tucked beneath the note, hidden between the folds, was a check. She blinked. Once, then again, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks. It was real. She touched it carefully, like it might tear under her fingertips. Her name was printed neatly at the top. The amount? $50,000. She didn't move. Couldn't. Her knees bent instinctively, and she sank into the booth he had just left, her body slowly lowering itself as if her heart could no longer hold the weight of the moment. The edges of the diner blurred. The voices faded. The clatter of dishes and murmurs of customers became background noise, like a radio in another room. All she could see was the note, the check, the empty space across from her where a quiet man had sat, sipping coffee like any other guest. Only he hadn't been any other guest at all. This wasn't a tip. This wasn't a mistake. It was intentional, precise, personal, and it made no sense. He hadn't known her, hadn't asked for anything more than a simple breakfast, hadn't even offered a name. But somehow, in the span of a single hour, he'd seen straight through her, past the apron, the polite smile, the practiced movements, to the weight she carried in silence. And he left her this. Not just money, but words. Words that felt like a hand reaching through the fog she'd been walking in for years, quietly placing something back into her hands that she hadn't realized was missing. Worth. She sat in the booth for what felt like hours, though it was probably just minutes. Lisa eventually noticed and wandered over from the counter, asking if she was okay. Keisha nodded vaguely, but her voice didn't come. Not yet. She couldn't explain what had just happened. Because how do you explain a stranger handing you your soul back? She pressed the note against her chest, fingers curled around the edges. 1,000 thoughts crashed through her head all at once. Questions, fears, possibilities. Was it real? Would the check bounce? Was she being tested? Had someone watched her for weeks, waiting for the right moment? Was it kindness? Was it charity? Was it fate? She didn't know. But deep down, something told her this wasn't random. It was deliberate. She thought back to his stillness, his eyes, the way he watched her, not like she was a server, but like she was someone who still mattered in a world that had long stopped noticing people like her. There was no performance in him, no ego. He hadn't wanted recognition or gratitude. He left quietly, without ceremony, like he had done this before. Or maybe, like he never had and never would again. She stood finally, folding the note gently and slipping it into her apron pocket. The check followed, held tightly between her fingers as she walked into the back hallway and leaned against the wall, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from relief, from disbelief, from something that felt like grace. That day had started like all the others, gray, tired, forgettable, a Tuesday like any other. But in the quiet corner booth of a worn-out diner, something extraordinary had happened. Not loud, not flashy, but life-changing, just the same. She didn't know his name. She didn't need to. Because some people don't change your life by being known. They change your life by seeing you when you've forgotten how to be seen. And when they leave, they don't just walk out the door. They leave a light behind. Disbelief and breakdown. It started small, like most things do. Just a question spoken aloud in the kitchen as Lisa held up the note again, her brows furrowed. "Do you think it's really him?" There was only one way to find out. A phone was pulled from an apron pocket. A few taps. A quick search. Clint Eastwood. Images filled the screen instantly. Press photos. Movie stills. Red carpet appearances. Black and white pictures from decades ago that barely looked like the man in the diner, except for the eyes, the jawline, the quiet weight in his stare, the shape of time, aged but unmistakable. Lisa turned the screen around, eyes wide. "It's him. That's him." Keisha didn't move. Her co-workers gathered closer. More phones came out. A chorus of "No way" and "Are you serious?" filled the tiny break room like an echo growing louder. "He was just here," one said. "He sat at that corner booth. I poured him coffee yesterday." He left her a check. Lisa nodded. $50,000. Silence. Then the whispers started. One of the dishwashers snapped a photo of the folded note, despite Keisha's quiet protest. It was too late. The ripple had begun. A friend texted a cousin. Someone posted to a private Facebook group. And from there, the story grew wings. By the time Keisha stepped outside for air, the diner felt too small, too loud. She needed space. She needed stillness. She crossed the sidewalk and sat on the curb beneath the awning, the drizzle still hanging in the air like a curtain. Her arms wrapped around her knees, the apron still tied tight around her waist. She stared at the wet pavement, watching small streams of water drift between the cracks in the concrete, tracing paths with nowhere to go. She was still trying to make sense of it, all of it, the note, the check, the moment. Inside, they were still talking. Her name was probably on someone's status update already. The waitress who got a check from Clint Eastwood. A simple title for a complicated moment. But that wasn't what she wanted. What she wanted was understanding. Why? Why her? Why that day? What had he seen in her that made him choose to leave something so extraordinary behind? She'd simply done her job. Poured coffee, took an order, gave the same care she gave every customer, every shift, No special attention, no big gestures. She didn't feel remarkable, not in the way people on the internet would want her to be. That's what scared her the most, that this would become a moment people projected their own stories onto, twisting it into something cleaner, neater, easier to understand. A Cinderella waitress and a movie star benefactor. A viral tale with a neat moral. But this wasn't a fairy tale. It was her life, and she was still in the middle of it. She pulled the note from her pocket again. It had been folded and unfolded so many times now that the crease had softened, but the ink remained bold. Her eyes scanned it for the 100th time, hoping to find something new between the lines. She hadn't cried again. Not yet. But her throat still ached from the weight of that first wave, and her chest felt tight with everything left unspoken. People walked past on the sidewalk, their umbrellas bobbing, their eyes passing over her without stopping. She looked like any other tired woman on her break. That, at least, was still normal. Then a car slowed at the curb. A window rolled down. A woman in the passenger seat leaned out slightly. "Hey, are you the waitress from the Clint Eastwood story?" Keisha didn't answer, just looked at her, unsure of what to say. The woman grinned, wide-eyed. "That's amazing! My sister just texted me about you. It's all over town already. What did the note say?" Keisha stood up slowly, brushing her hands on her apron. She didn't respond, just turned back toward the diner and walked inside, letting the door close behind her. The woman didn't mean harm, but it felt like something had already been taken. Inside, her co-workers quieted when she returned. The buzz of curiosity faded, replaced with something else. Awkwardness, reverence, distance. That was new. She wasn't just Keisha anymore. She was the woman Clint Eastwood gave a check to, and that terrified her. Lisa approached with a softness in her step, holding out a folded piece of paper. One of the customers wrote down a number, said he's with the paper, wants to talk to you. Keisha stared at the paper but didn't take it. "I don't want to talk to anyone," she said quietly. Lisa hesitated, then nodded, placing the paper on the counter and stepping back. The rest of the shift passed like a dream she wasn't fully awake for. Everything moved slower. Customers watched her more closely, smiled a little longer, whispered after she walked past. A few even offered compliments about her attitude, her smile, her kindness, things they might have noticed before but never said out loud. That night, at home, the phone didn't stop buzzing. Messages, missed calls, notifications she didn't want to check. Her mother was still in her chair by the window when Keisha walked in, and Jalen was on the floor with his school books spread out like usual. Neither of them knew yet. Keisha held the check in her purse like a secret, unsure when or how to tell them. When she finally did, hours later, her mother's eyes welled up, and she reached for her hand like she had when Keisha was a little girl who scraped her knee. Jalen asked if that meant she didn't have to work at the diner anymore. Keisha laughed, then cried again, then laughed through the tears. That night, when everyone was asleep, she sat in bed with the note in her lap, the check beside her, and the bedroom lamp casting a warm circle of light across the sheets. She didn't sleep. She just stared at the paper, over and over, asking the question that refused to settle. Why me? And maybe the better question, what am I supposed to do with this? Because if someone like him, someone who had lived 1,000 lives and seen 1,000 people, chose to believe in her, what excuse did she have to keep hiding in the shadows? Still, she didn't want cameras. She didn't want reporters knocking on the door. She didn't want a viral story. She just wanted clarity. What he had given her was more than generosity. It was responsibility, a challenge wrapped in kindness, to see herself the way he had seen her. and that would take time. She stared at the check, still tucked in the envelope, edges now soft from her constant handling. It sat on the nightstand like it didn't belong, like it had been placed there by mistake. $50,000. Not a mistake, not a joke. Real. She picked it up again, fingers trembling, not from shock anymore, but something deeper. A hollow ache in her chest that had been building all day, like pressure under the surface, looking for a crack to escape through. She brought the check closer, then farther, held it under the lamp like it would somehow fade if she stared hard enough. Then suddenly, without fully realizing she was doing it, her hands moved to tear it. Thumb and forefinger pinched the top corner. Paper folded, creased. Tear it, before someone else takes it from you. Before it becomes another story you lose control of. Before it changes you. Tear it. Because maybe you don't deserve it. Because maybe this was meant for someone else. Someone better. Someone stronger. Someone who hadn't once cried in a grocery store over the price of baby formula. Tear it. Because it's too much. Too heavy. Too public. Because now everyone's watching, waiting, wanting something from you. Because this check doesn't come with instructions, and you're so used to figuring everything out on your own. Her hands shook harder now. The paper held at a sharp angle. The first tiny tear formed in the top corner, like a whisper of self-doubt trying to make itself permanent. She froze. Her breath caught. Then, a sound behind her. "Mom?" Jalen's voice. Software. Sleep-warm. She looked up. He stood in the hallway, rubbing his eyes, his blanket dragging behind him. "You okay?" Keisha blinked fast, swallowed. "Yeah, baby," she said. "Just couldn't sleep." He nodded and patted over to her, curling up beside her without asking. She tucked the check beneath the blanket on her lap. They sat there in silence, his head on her arm, the weight of his body reminding her why she kept going all this time, why she had to. She looked down at the folded edge of the check, the torn corner barely visible now. No, she didn't tear it. Not tonight. The phone call. The rain had been falling lightly all morning, a soft misty drizzle that wrapped the world in a kind of hush. Keisha stood by her small kitchen window, towel in hand, drying the last of the dishes before work. Everything around her felt stubbornly normal. The hum of the fridge, the uneven drip from the bathroom faucet, the creak of her mother's rocking chair in the living room. Life moved forward, untouched by the earthquake still rippling beneath her ribs. But in the space between tasks, where silence crept in, her thoughts circled back to the same question. Why had he chosen her? Her phone buzzed sharply against the countertop, slicing through the quiet. The screen lit up with a blocked number. She stared at it, thumb hovering. Every unknown call in the past 3 days had carried the same flavor. Curiosity dressed as kindness, opportunity laced with assumption. She almost let it go. But something, instinct or maybe just exhaustion, made her answer. The voice was calm, polished, measured. "A representative," he said, "from Mr. Eastwood's team. He mentioned the booth, the note. Then came the ask. Discreet meeting. No cameras, no press. Just a conversation," he said. She barely whispered her yes before the line went dead. No name, no details. Just a meeting, time and place, spoken like a test she wasn't sure she was ready to pass. She stared at the dark screen, then at her own reflection in the window, and felt something shift. That night, sleep never came. Her body stayed still, but her mind ran laps. What if it was a mistake? What if she'd misunderstood the note? What if someone came tomorrow to take it all back? At 2:04 a.m., her phone buzzed again, this time a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Not trying to be rude, but how do we even know your story's real?" A second message followed. Some folks are saying it's staged, that you made the check yourself, saw it on Facebook. She stared at the screen, her breath tight. Her hands went cold before the heat crept up her neck. There were no threats, just doubt, just enough to bruise. She didn't reply. Instead, she tucked the phone under her pillow, rolled onto her side, and stared into the dark. She hadn't asked for any of this. Not the attention, not the noise, not the doubt from people who had never looked her way before, but suddenly felt entitled to question her truth. And yet, buried beneath the frustration was a quieter fear. What if she started to believe them? What if the years of surviving had made her forget how to receive something good without trying to explain it away? The next morning, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, buttoning the collar of her cleanest blouse. Her hands moved slowly, methodically. She didn't feel ready. But maybe ready wasn't required. Because deep down, she didn't just want to understand why he chose her. She needed to remember how to believe she was worth choosing. The car that arrived the next morning was sleek, unmarked, and completely unfamiliar to her world. She stepped inside with quiet gratitude and sat in the back seat, watching the city melt away. The driver said nothing, which she appreciated. It gave her space to breathe, to think, to prepare herself for whatever was coming. The ride took them north, away from the hum of Atlanta's streets, and into the soft, rolling hills that separated the city from the country. Eventually, the road narrowed, winding into the kind of place where mailboxes leaned with age and power lines dipped low over weather-worn fences. A small wooden sign came into view, simple and understated. "Private production. Keep out." The car passed it without slowing. They pulled into a modest clearing where trailers sat in quiet formation around what looked like a converted farmhouse. People moved calmly between tents and trucks, speaking in hushed voices, working around lights and gear that looked expensive but unassuming. There were no crowds, no paparazzi, just the quiet hum of a film set in motion. Someone met her at the curb, a man in his 30s with clear eyes and a clipboard tucked under his arm. He introduced himself, but his name barely registered. He walked her toward one of the trailers and opened the door without ceremony. Inside, the space was warm and simply furnished. A small couch, a reading lamp, books stacked neatly on a side table. It smelled faintly of old leather and coffee. She stepped inside slowly, eyes scanning the space, heart hammering beneath her ribs. He was already there, seated at a small wooden table, the same quiet presence she remembered. He rose when she entered, not dramatically, just naturally, as if this was a conversation long overdue. He gestured to the chair opposite his, and she sat. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, thick with meaning. Everything that had to be said had already been written in a note, but now there was room to breathe beyond the paper. He reached into a folder beside him and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the table. Her eyes landed on an image that felt more familiar than expected. A woman in a plain uniform, apron tied neatly at her waist, standing behind a diner counter with a tired but kind expression. Her hand rested on the shoulder of a boy no older than 7 or 8. There was something in their faces that spoke of survival, of love without flourish, of lives built in quiet effort. The message was unspoken but clear. This was the person he saw in her. Not a server, not a viral story, a legacy, a mirror. He pulled another envelope from the folder and set it next to the photo. Inside were documents, neatly clipped and highlighted, plans for something new, a foundation, an initiative, a way to give back not just once, but repeatedly, intentionally, with structure and purpose. The idea was bold, a platform for women like Keisha, working mothers, caregivers, overlooked champions of quiet strength. And he wanted her to be a part of it, not just symbolically, but fundamentally. A founding member, a decision maker, a voice. She didn't respond right away. Her hands rested on the envelope, but her mind had drifted to all the reasons she wasn't qualified. The college degree she never earned. The savings account that rarely crossed a few $100s. The jobs that came and went, mostly unnoticed. She wasn't a public speaker. She wasn't an executive. She was just tired. But under the exhaustion, there was something deeper. A seed of something that had waited years to be planted. He wasn't handing her charity. He was offering her responsibility. And that terrified her more than anything. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't empty. It held space for decision. When she finally nodded, her breath shook, but her spine held firm. Outside, the clouds had started to shift. The drizzle gave way to light, cutting through in thin beams that glinted off the trailer windows. A woman was waiting as she exited, tall, sharply dressed, confident. She introduced herself as the project lead who would be helping shape the foundation's operations. Her name was Elena, and her handshake was firm but warm. She spoke with clarity and vision, painting a future that felt, for the first time, like it might include Keisha, not just as a story, but as a builder. Back home, the apartment felt different, smaller in some ways, but steadier. The photo from the trailer now lived on her bedside table, beside a picture of Jalen in his school uniform. The two faces seemed to speak across time. A reminder that stories don't end at survival. Some just begin there. The first few weeks of involvement were quiet. Long emails, video calls, brainstorm sessions where Keisha mostly listened, still learning the language of leadership. But slowly, her words began to find their place. She offered insight no one else in the room could see, suggested changes to the application process that lowered barriers for women without references or resumes. She raised her hand when others hesitated, and people listened. But success never arrives without challenge. The first crack came from outside. A blogger posted a critical article suggesting the gift was performative, a publicity stunt tied to an upcoming film release. The post went viral. Comment sections flared. People questioned her story, her intentions, her authenticity. Some accused her of being planted, others of manipulating pity. One headline read, "From Waitress to Boardroom, the Cinderella Lie?" The doubt hit her harder than she expected. For days, she avoided the news, shut down social media, pulled back from meetings. The weight of public gaze felt heavier than the weight of poverty had ever been. But Elena called her late one night. Her voice was calm but firm. "You didn't ask for this spotlight," she said. "But now that it's here, you have a choice. You can shrink, or you can take up space." Those words echoed. Keisha showed up to the next meeting with notes. She spoke clearly, suggested a partnership with small community centers that would make the foundation's grants accessible to people with no internet or smartphones. She pushed for transparency in the selection process, for inclusion on every level. The room listened, and this time, no one questioned whether she belonged there. A few days later, an invitation came from a community college to speak at their women's leadership event. She almost declined, but Jalen's face, when he heard about it, changed her mind. She stepped onto the stage with shaking hands, but by the end of her story, the room was in tears. Not because it was tragic, but because it was true. That night, she walked home slower than usual, not because she was tired, but because for the first time, she felt rooted in her own life, not running from it, not shrinking inside of it, but living it, on purpose. The moment she had sat down across from him in that trailer hadn't just changed her path. It had opened a door. And now, She wasn't just walking through it. She was holding it open for others. The meeting. The air outside the production trailer was unusually still that morning. A low fog hung over the hills like a veil, muting the world in soft grays and silvers. The trees swayed gently, and even the gravel underfoot seemed to crunch more quietly. Keisha had returned to the set after several weeks of phone calls, planning sessions, and a growing sense that her life was slowly shifting from something endured to something shaped. She had been invited back, not for cameras, not for ceremony, but for something more personal, something unspoken, yet understood. Inside the trailer, the warmth wrapped around her like a blanket. The space hadn't changed, still modest, still practical, still filled with the quiet presence of a man who lived a life much louder than he liked to let on. As she sat across from him again, there was no weight of expectation, only a shared sense that something deeper needed to be acknowledged. That morning, Clint shared something he hadn't before. Not part of the foundation, not part of the diner moment, something closer to the chest. Her name was Christina. He spoke of her with reverence, an elegant, private kind of love that didn't need to be dramatic to be felt. She hadn't been a movie star, nor someone the media often focused on. She had lived simply, worked quietly, and carried a warmth that stayed with people long after she left a room. She had passed away after a long illness, one that she faced with dignity, grace, and an almost frightening calm. She hadn't wanted attention for it, nor pity. She had simply wanted to continue being herself, until the very end. Keisha reminded him of that kind of strength, not just in her smile, or her poise, or the way she handled hardship, but in the unseen parts, the way she moved without asking for applause, the way she comforted others without asking for comfort herself. It was the same quiet fire he'd watched burn in Christina, the kind that made people feel safe, even when the world around them wasn't. For a man who had spent much of his life surrounded by fame, it had always been people like that who left the deepest impression. Not the ones who took up the most space, but the ones who carried weight without being noticed. People like Christina. People like Keisha. In the weeks since their initial meeting, Clint had been watching her from a distance. Not in surveillance, but in spirit. He'd followed her involvement in the foundation, listened to feedback from his team, and read the messages that came in after her speech in Savannah. He had seen how she showed up to every planning meeting prepared, how she listened more than she spoke, and how, when she did speak, the room always shifted toward her. She had begun as someone uncertain, understandably so, but she was becoming something else, something steady. But with growth came pressure, and not all of it was easy. A few days before the meeting, Keisha had been confronted with a moment that nearly sent her retreating. One of the foundation's donors, an older executive with deep pockets and a louder voice, had questioned her role on a public call. It hadn't been malicious, just dismissive. He had spoken as if she wasn't in the room, referred to her as a symbolic figure, a story, not a contributor. For hours after, Keisha had spiraled inward. The voice of doubt that had once been quiet grew louder. She questioned whether she had been wrong to say yes to any of this, whether she was simply riding on someone else's belief and not her own ability, whether she should step back before she was pushed out. She didn't mention it to Elena. She didn't complain. But Clint knew, because one of his team members had called him, worried. Not about her qualifications, but about her silence. So he asked her to come back, not for defense, but for a reminder. That day in the trailer, she sat with her shoulders tight, her posture careful. And he saw it. The retreat just beginning, the self-erasure she had carried like armor for so long. He offered something unexpected, a second gift. This time, not financial, not symbolic, something real, something foundational. A full scholarship to finish her degree. Not honorary, not cosmetic. A real opportunity to return to school on her own terms. Time, resources, mentorship. Everything she had sacrificed years ago when survival became more important than ambition. He also offered her space, a sabbatical of sorts, a window of time to focus on herself, her son, and her growth, without the daily weight of public expectation. She could remain on the board, stay involved in the foundation's vision. But he wanted her to remember that investing in herself was part of the mission too. She didn't respond right away. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she pressed them flat against her thighs to steady them. In her mind, the automatic response was to decline, to say thank you and turn it down, that she was fine, that she didn't need it, that others deserved it more. But that voice, of constant sacrifice, of self-denial, of always putting herself last, was beginning to crack. She thought of Jalen, watching her wake up before dawn every day, knowing how hard she worked. She thought of her mother, who had once told her that strength wasn't in never needing help, but in knowing when to accept it. And she thought of that moment in the diner, when a folded piece of paper had shifted the trajectory of her life in silence. So she said yes, not aloud, but in her body, in her breath, in the way she sat up straighter, finally, like she belonged to her own life again. Clint didn't celebrate, didn't stand or cheer. He simply nodded, the way someone does when a puzzle piece falls perfectly into place. That day, something shifted between them. Their connection had begun in anonymity, in a quiet act of recognition. But now, it had deepened into something mutual. Trust, respect, a shared understanding of how rare it is to find someone who not only listens, but listens with purpose. The road back from the set felt different than the first time. The fog had lifted, and the hills were bathed in soft light. Keisha stared out the window, her reflection caught faintly in the glass. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was reacting to life. She felt like she was designing it. There were still challenges ahead, still skeptics, deadlines, long days. But now there was also a path, clearer than before. Clint had once said that people like her were the backbone of this country, that they kept the world turning while others took the credit. She hadn't believed it then, but she was starting to. And sometimes, that was the first step in changing everything. The bigger gift time moved differently after everything changed. It didn't speed up or slow down. It just shifted. Keisha woke each morning with a clarity she hadn't known before. The haze that used to hang over her like a low-hanging cloud was gone. In its place was a sense of quiet urgency. Life, it turned out, had always been waiting for her. She had simply been too weighed down to reach for it. The gift Clint had given her was never about the check. It was what followed. The doors it opened, the hands it reached for. The voice it gave to someone who had spent years convincing herself that silence was strength. In the weeks that followed her second meeting with him, those doors continued to swing open, one after another. Not loudly, not with headlines, but with quiet significance. He had made a call to a scholarship foundation he had worked with for years, a group dedicated to finding students with passion but no path. Within days, Keisha found herself speaking with one of the directors, who asked about her son. She didn't pitch him. She didn't beg. She simply described Jalen, and it was enough. Jalen had always been curious. Even as a toddler, he'd disassemble his toys just to see how they worked. In school, he devoured science books and begged to watch documentaries while other kids fought for cartoons. He wasn't loud about it, but his notebooks were filled with sketches of wind turbines and notes about clean energy. He talked about engineering the way other kids talked about superheroes. He didn't know anyone who did it for a living, but he believed he could. When the letter came in the mail weeks later, sealed in navy and gold, Keisha read it twice before the words landed. A full scholarship, room and board, books, travel. Covered. The first person in their family to go to college on a full ride. She sat on the edge of her bed that night, the letter in her lap, watching Jalen sleep, the light from the hallway pooling softly on his blanket. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Joy settled over her gently, like sunlight warming her skin. But it wasn't just Jalen whose world was shifting. Keisha's too was expanding in ways she never could have imagined. One afternoon, while sitting in a quiet cafe with Elena going over foundation logistics, she was introduced to a woman named Rena. Sharp, kind-eyed, a director of community partnerships for a national nonprofit. Rena had been following Keisha's journey. Not the headlines, but the work. The proposals she'd shaped. The talks she'd given. The clarity with which she saw the invisible spaces where people slipped through the cracks. Rena offered her a position, part-time to start, with a project focused on empowering single mothers through financial literacy and housing stability. It wasn't glamorous, but it was important. Keisha didn't accept right away. She asked questions. She took the time. And then, when it felt right, she said yes. Work shifted from survival to purpose. Her days still started early, and she still came home tired. But now, her fatigue felt like something earned, not endured. She moved with a sense of agency, like she was finally steering the wheel of her own life. And then, just as things felt steady, the past came knocking. It started with a voicemail, a number she didn't recognize, a voice she hadn't heard in nearly 10 years. Marcus, her husband, the same man who had left when Jalen was barely a year old, the man who had promised to come back but never had, who had chosen distance over difficulty, who had vanished into another life, leaving her to hold their world alone. He said he had seen her on the news, that he was proud of her, that he wanted to reconnect, said he had changed, said he missed Jalen, said a lot of things. She didn't call back, not right away. But the messages kept coming. Emails, a letter. Eventually he showed up outside the diner, standing awkwardly by the newspaper stand like a ghost, trying to remember how to be real. She saw him from inside, standing there in the shadow of the awning, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The same slouched posture, the same tired eyes. But he wasn't the same, not to her. Keisha stepped outside, arms crossed, her stance calm, but unmoving. He tried to speak, but she held up a hand and let the silence do the talking. Everything he needed to hear was already between them, carved by years of absence and unspoken apologies. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply told him that their chapter had closed a long time ago, that Jalen was thriving, that she was too, and that she wished him well. But there was no space for old weight in this new life. When she walked back into the diner, Lisa raised an eyebrow. Keisha simply nodded once and went back to work. Some victories didn't need parades. Jalen asked about him later. She told the truth, gently, that he had reached out, that she had listened, that they were okay without him. Jalen said nothing at first. Then he looked down at the model solar car he'd been building, adjusted a wheel, and nodded. That was the end of it. A few weeks later, Keisha received another unexpected invitation, this time from Clint's eldest daughter. It wasn't formal. No press, no audience. Just an afternoon at the family ranch in Carmel Valley, a quiet gathering, an introduction. She hadn't known what to expect. What do you bring to a gathering of people who grew up in the shadow of greatness? What do you say to the children of a man who changed your life? She brought a small plant, a fiddle leaf fig in a ceramic pot she'd painted herself. Not expensive, but personal. The ranch was sprawling but unpretentious. Acres of green. The air smelled like salt and wood smoke. The gathering was small, just family, a few close friends, and the kind of laughter that only comes from people who've known each other longer than they've understood themselves. They welcomed her with warmth, not curiosity. There were no questions about the diner, no mention of the check. Just people who had heard about her from someone they loved and respected. She sat on the porch beside his daughter, watching the horizon stretch out beneath a sky so wide it made her feel small in the best way. They spoke about Christina, about how she had shaped the family in ways that never made the news, about the strength it took to hold up a life built in public while keeping your private world sacred. Keisha listened closely, quietly amazed at how much she recognized in someone she had never met. That day, she understood something deeper about the man who had left her that note. He hadn't been acting out of pity. He hadn't even been acting out of kindness alone. He had been continuing a legacy, passing forward the light that Christina had once given him. Keisha left the ranch that evening with a mason jar of fresh honey, a box of handwritten recipes, and the kind of peace that doesn't announce itself. It just settles. Back in Atlanta, life moved forward. The foundation launched officially that fall. Applications rolled in. Stories arrived by the hundreds. Women from small towns, big cities, shelters, trailers, second shifts, library basements. Each one different. Each one familiar. Keisha read every single one. Late at night after Jalen went to bed. Early in the morning before the world woke up. She read them all. She saw herself in pieces, in their exhaustion, in their humor, in their determination. And when she voted on who to fund, she did so with both head and heart. One day, while reviewing applications in a quiet corner of the library, she paused over one in particular. A woman named Nadine, 37, 2 kids, former nurse, forced out of work after an injury, living out of her car, enrolled in free night classes, dreaming of building a mobile clinic for underserved areas. The details cut deep. The clarity of her vision reminded Keisha of the letters she used to write but never send. When Nadine's name was approved for full funding, Keisha closed her laptop, placed her hands in her lap, and sat very still. Some things didn't need celebration. They just needed to happen. Later that week, a check arrived. Not for her, but for Jalen. A second surprise scholarship, this time for a summer STEM program in California. The letter came with a handwritten note from Clint himself, enclosed in a small blue envelope. Keisha didn't need to read it. She knew what it would say, because by then, she understood that the real gift wasn't money. It was belief. And belief, when passed down with intention, becomes something far more powerful than charity. It becomes transformation. The ripple effect. It started with a photo, one snapped during her first major speech in Savannah, right as she stepped off stage into a crowd of applause. A freelance photographer captured the moment she smiled. Not for the audience, not for the attention, but for herself. That photo ended up on the homepage of a news site within days, and the ripple began. First regional, then national. Her story wasn't just the story of a waitress anymore. It became a symbol, reshaped and reworded across articles, blogs, podcasts, and television features. Her face appeared on morning show segments. Her name mentioned in headlines she had never imagined she'd see. The narrative was easy for them to sell. The woman who went from refilling coffee to sitting beside a Hollywood legend, shaping the future of single mothers in America. The media loved it. The internet consumed it. And the world watched as Keisha Miller became more than a person. She became a public figure. But while the attention swelled, she stayed still. The truth was quieter than the headlines. It was found in her morning routines that hadn't changed. in the way she still clipped coupons even when she didn't need to, in the late-night calls she made to scholarship applicants, in her refusal to move out of her apartment just yet, even though she could now afford better. Her neighborhood still felt like home, and home, for her, had never been about space. It had always been about roots. As her visibility grew, so did the offers. Agents reached out, hinting at book deals and reality shows. Brands wanted to partner. Fashion companies offered sponsorships. A television network sent a script loosely based on her story, asking if she'd like to be a consultant. One celebrity even offered her an appearance fee to speak at a luxury product launch. Every offer came with the same promise: you don't have to say much, just let us use your face. The temptation was real. After years of scarcity, the idea of stability felt magnetic. It whispered of ease. It promised to lift her burdens with the stroke of a pen. But behind each offer was a quiet trade. Her story, rewritten. Her image, repackaged. Her life turned into marketing. So she declined. Not loudly, not publicly. She simply said no, over and over, until the offers began to slow. She didn't scold or moralize. She just held her ground. Because she hadn't come this far to be owned. Instead, she poured her time into something she could control. With the help of a few quiet donors, she opened a small community cafe on the same street where she had once stood in the rain waiting for the bus. The sign out front was hand-painted. The windows were always open. And every Sunday, without fail, the cafe offered free meals. No questions asked. A warm plate, a real table, a name remembered. The first Sunday, only 6 people showed up. The second, 20. By the 6th month, the cafe was serving close to 90 guests a week. Some were homeless, some were families, some were just tired and needed a place where they could be fed without shame. Keisha remembered all their names. She learned their stories, just as someone once had learned hers. She didn't need the spotlight to feel seen anymore. She had learned how to build light from the inside out. One afternoon, while cleaning up after a Sunday shift, she came across a familiar face seated near the window. One of the women who had applied to the Foundation's scholarship program, but hadn't made it through the first round due to limited funding. Her name was Tasha. She was young, barely 23, raising 2 children alone and working nights at a laundromat. Her application had stuck with Keisha, not because it was perfect, but because it had been honest. Without thinking twice, Keisha made the call. She paid for Tasha's first semester of night classes at a local college, quietly, anonymously. She did it again for another woman the following month, then another. She never told the board, never issued a press release. Some things didn't need to be a statement. They just needed to be done. As the months passed, she began writing more. At first, just scattered notes, reflections, memories. But eventually, the writing began to take shape. Not a book, not a memoir, just a single blog post, a piece of her voice placed into the world without permission from anyone. She titled it, "The Power of a Note." In it, she wrote not about Clint Eastwood or the check or the fame, but about the moment someone saw her. About how sometimes the smallest act, done at the right time, becomes a crack of light in an otherwise dark tunnel. She wrote about the weight of being overlooked and how much it matters when someone stops to say, "I see you." She posted it late one night, without telling anyone. By morning, it had been shared over 2,000 times. Not by influencers or journalists, but by teachers, nurses, single dads, grocery clerks. People who understood that power wasn't always loud, that healing wasn't always public. That being seen was sometimes the only thing keeping someone from giving up. The world tried to make her a celebrity, but she chose something else. She chose to become a mirror, and in that reflection, thousands of people began to recognize their own quiet strength. 1 year later, the rain fell gently, the kind that made the world feel a little slower, a little softer. It had been exactly 1 year to the day since that quiet morning in Rosie's diner. The day a folded note tucked beneath a plate of eggs and toast had changed everything. Keisha woke early, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Her alarm was no longer a call to battle against the world, but a signal that she had another day to shape with intention. Jalen had left for college 2 months ago. The apartment felt quieter now, but not empty. He was studying environmental engineering at a university 2 states away, having earned his spot through hard work and a full scholarship, a combination of his own brilliance and the quiet doors that had been opened for him. He called every Sunday, sometimes more. He always ended the call with a casual, "Thanks, Mom." But she could feel the weight of those words more than he ever needed to say. They were heavy with gratitude, not just for what she had given him, but for who she had become. Her mother's health had stabilized. The arthritis hadn't vanished, but the flare-ups had become manageable. With better medication and time to rest, she had even returned to some of her gardening, not in their old backyard, but on a small plot outside a new community garden they had helped fund with donations from the foundation. It was there that she often hummed softly while pulling weeds or planting seeds, as if she was stitching a lullaby back into the earth. Her joy was quiet, but visible, a long overdue exhale after years of holding everything in. Keisha herself had changed, not just in circumstance, but in presence. She had begun taking college classes part-time, picking up where she left off so many years ago. The textbooks were heavy, and the assignments occasionally overwhelming, but her mind was sharp, and her will sharper. She didn't need a degree to feel whole, but she wanted to finish what she'd started, not because someone told her to, but because the future she'd once put on hold finally had a place again. Her mornings were spent working at a local nonprofit focused on housing and outreach for displaced women. It wasn't glamorous work. There were no headlines, no applause. But she listened to stories like hers every day. Stories of loss, resilience, fight, and survival. She offered resources when she could, direction when they asked, and sometimes just space for someone to sit and not be judged. She knew the power of being seen. It was a currency more valuable than most people realized. The foundation was still growing. The Lighthouse Initiative had funded over 100 women in its first year. Applications came from across the country. Keisha read as many as she could, sometimes late into the night, pausing every so often to breathe deeply, humbled by the echo of her own past in so many of their words. These weren't stories for show. They were lived experiences, raw and real and beautifully unpolished, just like hers had been. She still worked at the community cafe she'd helped start, now staffed by a rotating group of volunteers and graduates from the programs she helped build. Every Sunday they served meals to anyone who walked in. No questions, no sign-ins, just a seat, a plate, and a sense of dignity. On slow days, she wiped tables herself. On busy days, she stepped back and let the team take charge. The walls of the cafe had become her sanctuary, lined with handwritten notes from guests, each one a small thank you for something much larger than food. She had refused every sponsorship, declined every book deal, said no to television, documentaries, interviews. Her story had already been told in the way she chose to live now. And that was enough. Her success didn't need to be loud to be real. But there was one thing she had kept, a framed copy of her own note, the one that started it all. It hung on the wall beside the entrance to her office. The original was stored in a box with other keepsakes she couldn't quite display. But this replica reminded her every day of the moment she was seen, of the spark that had become a torch she now carried forward. That morning, As the rain painted the windows, she stopped by a small corner cafe in the city. It wasn't fancy, just another little diner tucked between a laundromat and a barber shop. She had found it by accident during one of her early outreach meetings months ago. The food was simple, the coffee strong, and the chairs mismatched. It reminded her of where she came from. She took a seat by the window and opened her notebook, not to write anything in particular, just to clear her head. The waitress came over, maybe 19 or 20, hair pulled back tight, eyes tired, smile forced. Her movements were sharp, her posture alert, not from enthusiasm, but from the muscle memory of someone who had learned to move fast because life didn't wait for her. She poured coffee without saying much. Keisha watched her walk to the next table. She saw the scuff on her shoes, the way her shoulders hunched between orders, the way she tucked her notepad into her apron like she might forget where she put it if she didn't. The meal was quick: eggs, toast, and fruit. The same order she had once served to a man who changed her life without asking for anything in return. She finished her plate, slid her chair back quietly, and reached into her purse. Inside was a folded check for $1,000 and a note, written that morning, just in case. She didn't think she'd use it, but something in that waitress told her otherwise. She tucked the note under the plate, just beneath the edge of the napkin, folded once, neatly, no fanfare, no name on the envelope. She stepped out into the rain, hood up, bag over her shoulder. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The note read, "You reminded me of someone I once was, and someone I hope you'll become. Keep going. KMM." She walked slowly down the block, the drizzle soft against her skin. She felt no rush. There were no cameras, no headlines waiting. But somewhere behind her, a young woman would find a note. A moment? A spark? And in that instant, the cycle would begin again. Because sometimes, the smallest gesture carried the biggest echo. And sometimes, the biggest gift wasn't about money at all. It was about choosing to see someone before the world did. Just like someone had once done for her. Outro. A year later, Keisha didn't just carry her own transformation, she carried the hopes of others still waiting for theirs. She didn't walk through the open door and close it behind her. She held it open, steady, for those still finding the strength to rise. Because real change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a folded note, a warm meal, a name remembered, a hand extended. Kindness isn't just a moment, it's a message. And when we pass it on, it becomes something more. A legacy built not on noise, but on intention. One act at a time, one life at a time. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything.